course, the main thing, of course, we will be getting into today is I'll be talking, of course, about the Spanish-American War that occurred pretty much in mid-1898, April to July 1898. Of course, is when it took place. Of course, the United States fought against, of course, Spain. And this is a continuation of the PowerPoint lecture that I do have up here, which you can see there. And you can see here that, I'll get to it in a little bit, but one of the major events they talked about, of course, in the video was the destruction of the Maine, the USS Maine. It's one of the things that sparked the war. And, of course, everybody talked about that slogan that's real popular later. You see the little logo at the top right. I mean, hope you see that or not. But remember the Maine. That became the big slogan that they talked about. And so I'll talk about that today, about what that was. So first thing, of course, we want to do today is we want to first talk about with the Spanish-American War is, what were the causes of it. There were a lot of causes of it, why the war broke out. A lot of it had to do with the relationship between Cuba and Spain. The Spanish had always called Cuba the ever faithful isle. They've had Cuba forever. This is going back to Christopher Columbus. So you're looking at a period of it was over almost 400 years, really, that the Spanish had been in control of Cuba, but they treated the Cubans horribly over there. And they had a lot of violent revolutions that occurred. There's one there you see called the Cuban Revolution that occurred between 1868 to 78. It was often called the 10 Years' War because it lasted 10 years. And it was a bloody event, of course, in Cuba. That was a major reason for the problems that they had later. Here's, of course, a slide on this. And they then had another one, which happened later in 1895. They had another revolution. I think the Cuban Revolution 1895, or it's called different names, I think. That one was caused by a tariff that was called the Wilson-Gorman tariff. And what that did was it raised tariffs on any kind of raw sugar that was coming in to American ports. Because I don't know if you know much about the 1890s. The U.S. was going through a depression that was caused by the Panic of 1893. I think the depression lasted from 1893 to, I want to say, 97. And so a lot of people thought that tariffs had a lot to do with why the depression happened, along with having silver as a currency rather than gold. So a lot of the Republicans, had wanted to go on the gold standard, and of course, eventually they would also have higher tariffs. However, it hurt the Cubans, put pretty much their plantations out of business, and they couldn't sell their sugar because most of it was being sold to the United States. So it just rotted, basically. Cubans lost their jobs, and so a lot of them revolted against the Spanish. And so the Spanish brought in this general you see there. I think I've got a picture of him on a slide. I think I've got him. There he is, which is General Valeriano Weyler, who the newspaper, yellow journalism newspapers, called him the Butcher. And the reason why he was called the Butcher was he took a lot of people that rebelled against the Spanish into concentration camps. You probably think of concentration camps like maybe Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or anything like that. But he was really the first to do it, to put people in concentration camps by the thousands. Thousands died. A lot of people died of starvation throughout the country. The guy on the right there, how horrible he looks. Looks like something out of the Nazi concentration camps there. So, yeah, they were right to call him that, the Butcher, because, what the Spanish were doing. But it actually did help to put down the revolt. I think they eventually did put it down. but it took a couple years for them to eventually do it. Now, of course, the yellow press got really involved in this, in the war. Of course, as you see right there, it's a very famous cartoon painting showing the fact that you had this case where these two newspapers got involved in the war, which I'll put up here for you. You had let me first talk about what happened with Weyler. His tactics were soon, talked about in the newspapers, like the so-called yellow press. I haven't really explained what that means, about what it's about. But what was the yellow press? Well, it was like the modern newspaper at the time in the United States that used sensationalism. The Cubans are getting all killed, and just huge, titles that would, be on the paper. War declared, just stuff like that. And so it was from a cartoon they talked about, I think called The Yellow Kid, where the name came from. And so at the time they were starting to print stuff in color, and all that. So these were newspapers that were using sensationalism. And there were two newspapers, not that one. There were two newspapers that were in circulation at the time that were the New York Journal and the New York World. And they started this circulation war over Cuba, over the Cuban conflict, basically. And New York Journal was owned and edited by William Randolph Hearst. I'm sure you've heard of the Hearst family. They're very wealthy. They're still around. And then New York World was owned and edited by Joseph Pulitzer. You probably heard of Pulitzer because he's one of the Pulitzer Prize named after where it came from. And the yellow press, in a sense, helped escalate the war. That's what they basically did by this circulation war. They printed a lot of negative, headlines against the Spanish, drummed up a lot of support to fight the war against Spain. And so they were part of the reason why this occurred. There's a famous story. I don't know if you probably may have heard about this. You ever heard of Frederick Remington? He's a very famous artist, known for doing a lot of paintings of the Old West. He also painted the Rough Riders and other soldiers in I think he painted the Battle of San Juan Hill and all that. And there's a story where he sent Frederick Remington down there to take pictures of what's going on with the Cuban Revolution. And Remington wired him back via telegram and said, "Hey, there's nothing going on. It's boring. I want to come home." And so Randolph Hearst made the famous quote you see there. He said, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." So some believe that the war was kind of started by the American press, more or less, and not just the conflicts between Spain and the United States at the time. So now the only problem was that at the time, if you study about United States, William McKinley, he was the president of the United States. Remember we talked about how 1896 William McKinley, Republican from Ohio, had defeated William Jennings Bryan. Of course, Bryan, he lost him. He was a Democrat. And McKinley was, he didn't really want to get in the war. McKinley preferred diplomacy. Like if they could somehow avoid the war, have ministers, kind of solve the differences between Spain and Cuba, that would be the best way to do it. We hadn't really fought a war in years. Our last major war we fought was really the Civil War. But we hadn't really fought too many wars at this point. So he wanted us to stay neutral, and we kind of did between 1897 and 98. After McKinley came in, he tried to keep the country neutral at that point. However, there were several incidents that kind of forced the United States eventually into the war. There was this one story about a letter that was published. I think I've got a picture of it right here, which is the, there it is. The Depuis de l'Homme letter was very famous and it basically was this letter that one of their ministers to the United States from Spain said that basically President William McKinley was a weak politician. I think his famous quote was, he was weak and a bitter for the admiration of the crowd. He was a would-be politician. So he basically insulted our president. And this angered a lot of people. And so that was another reason, of course, why, the United States, got involved in the war. So that's one thing there that was. Then, of course, the incident y'all have probably heard about, that's very, very famous, of course, is the USS Maine, which that was a U.S. dreadnought, like battleship, that was sent to the Cuba, and it was sent there to basically protect Americans and also American property there. It blew up all of a sudden on February 15th, 1890. It just exploded in Havana Harbor, just blew up, and it killed more than 260-something sailors, 266 sailors, I think, died from it. And so a lot of those, newspapers, I told you, like yellow journalist newspapers, then took off with it, sensationalism, with that, and said, hey, they blew up our ship. We need to declare war on them. And so after that basically, so everybody thought, the Spanish were behind it. And pretty much throughout the war, that's what people believed about the war. It was actually investigated after the war to find out what happened to the Maine. Of course, they thought that what had happened was that the Spanish had used some kind of mine, maybe in the harbor to blow it up. But they actually found out later that some kind of spark or something happened in the magazine, and it blew up the ship. It was a total accident. But because of it, the full rallying cry, against Spain became "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," is what people said. And so that became, the whole rallying cry of why the United States got in there. So there's kind of a sensational, painting there, describing all the people getting blown up and stuff. They probably put that in newspapers and stuff. So people really were, wanting to get in the war. Now, we didn't quite get in the war yet. That happened in February, like I said, of 1898. McKinley still refused to intervene in the war against the Spanish with Cuba. And this, of course, angered a lot of people as well. Teddy Roosevelt, if you know much about him, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in McKinley's administration. He said about McKinley that he has no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. And so McKinley still wanted some kind of diplomacy. He thought they still could, find some kind of peaceful means to, find, way not to go to war. And so one of the first things that McKinley tried to do, if you know about this, was McKinley and the U.S. State Department issued a series of ultimatums against the Spanish. This happened in March of 1898, which the Spanish, believe it or not, actually accepted the ultimatum. What was in the ultimatum? Do you have that? There were actually three parts to the ultimatum that were in it. One was that they had to end the Cuban Revolution, which was kind of still going on. The people that were rebelling were kind of guerrillas, fighting guerrilla warfare. So they wanted to try and get the Cuban rebels to sign some kind of armistice. And then two, they wanted to try to negotiate some type of movement to create like either an independent state for Cuba, or they would allow the Cubans to have their own self-government but still be under the Spanish crown. So that was, and of course the main thing they wanted too was to get rid of the, abolish the concentration camps, because it was doing all the Spanish, killing all the Spanish people off and all that. It's a great idea. However, what happened was the Warhawks in Congress didn't want to do that. They wanted to go to war against the Spanish. They saw this as a great opportunity to, maybe take over Cuba, I think is one thing they were thinking of for sure. And so you can see there the United States eventually declared war on the Spanish on April 11th, 1898, and then Kennedy signed it. So that was initially what happened, the beginning of the war. There was this deal where I think he was a congressman in the U.S. Congress. He came up with this thing called the Teller Amendment. If you know much about it, the Teller Amendment. And it's kind of this anti-imperialist resolution that they came up with right there. I'll put it on the slide for you real quick here. He was the guy, Henry Teller, came up with it. It's basically a resolution saying that they would give the Cubans independence. They become an independent state. But they also said that the U.S. would not annex it, is what we would say. And we're there just to help them gain independence. Is primarily what we want to try to do. And that's primarily what the U.S. does do. But you saw in the video, the U.S. takes advantage of the fact that the Spanish Empire, which wasn't much left of it, I guess, at the time, we just took their territories easily because they're in such a weak state overall. So that's basically, how the war begins at that point with the so-called Spanish-American War that happened in 1898. You can see it was a very short war, one of the shortest wars in American history. 113 days. That's it. That's like 3 to 4 months or 10 weeks. It's about how long it was. And John Hay, none of you heard of him, but John Hay, of course, was Secretary of State under William McKinley. He called it the Splendid Little War. That's what he dubbed it. And what he meant by that was that it was a war that was just so easy. Very few people were killed in the war. The U.S. got so much out of it, like territory and prestige afterwards, made us a world power. That's why they called it that, Splendid Little War. And so the name kind of stuck. And so that's basically why they called it that. The U.S. also passed an act through Congress that was called the Volunteer Army Act. It was on April 22nd, 1898. This act, what it did was it created a bunch of volunteer units to fight in the war. The reason why was because the American Army was not that good. We were terrible. Our military was not that. I think our Navy might have been a little better than our Army, but we basically didn't have enough forces. And so it helped create one of those volunteer units, which was called the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, which became very, very famous later as the so-called Rough Riders, which was a nickname that the Yellow Press called them. And they would, of course, be involved in taking Cuba at the time. And one of the men that, of course, that was involved, and you, of course, have heard of, is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, you know about him, was one of the big heroes of the war. In fact, it made him a sensational hero that eventually allowed him to become governor of New York, vice president, and president of the United States within, I want to say 3 years. It was amazing how fast he went up, politically because of that. He used it to propel himself politically into the war. And so I think here's a slide. Here's a slide if you want to look at it later. That's the actual quote by John Hay. It was a splendid little war, begun with highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit. So there he is, Teddy Roosevelt. They called him TR for short. I don't know if you heard of that before, Teddy Roosevelt. But yeah, it made him, very, very popular. He wasn't actually the head of the Rough Riders. There was actually a colonel named Leonard Wood who actually led them. But by the time the war was over, he was, I think, the head of it and became real famous because of it. He would later become famous in the Battle of San Juan Hill, helped charge it and all that. But before I get into that, I do need to talk about what happened first. You saw in the beginning. Oh, and by the way, before I get to that, I did want to add a few other comments too. This is the amount of troops, by the way, that fought in the actual war. 270,000 Americans volunteered to fight in the Spanish-American War. Most people don't know that, but a lot of people volunteered, including some ex-Confederates, which I'll talk about later. They were involved in the war. But yeah, you had all kinds of people that fought in the war. And also, they don't forget about it, but close to maybe 4 or 5% of the forces were actually African American that fought in the war. I think it was the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, participated in the taking of San Juan Hill. Most people forget about that. They try to kind of cover that up later, I know, but they were involved, in the war and fighting as well. They were big heroes. Of course, the video had talked about how the first major engagement of the war was actually a naval battle, the so-called Battle of Manila Bay, which happened on May 1st, 1898, happened in the Philippines. You know about, I told you about Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which was Teddy Roosevelt. Right before he volunteered, he wired Commodore Dewey, who was in Hong Kong, China, and told him basically to go ahead and attack the Philippines. And so his fleet, which I think had, I want to say 5 or 6 ships or something like that, then sailed, of course, southward to the Philippines. On the night of, I think it's, I want to say April 30th, they sailed past Corregidor, which is a fortress there, island. They sailed into Manila Bay. And when the sun came up, his fleet opened fire on the Spanish Navy, which was in Manila Bay. See, the battle lasted about seven hours. They wiped out the whole fleet. They sunk the whole thing. Like the whole Spanish fleet was just destroyed. And there was a famous quote I always like to mention about, which was very, very famous. The most famous quote from the whole entire war was a quote where Commodore Dewey said to, I think one of his captains, he said, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." That was considered like a big, big quote of the whole war. Yeah, only a few Americans were wounded. I think there was one guy that died from heat stroke. So they just easily just took it. And so it was a lopsided battle, totally lopsided, sunk their whole fleet. It does allow the United States later to eventually seize control of the Philippines afterwards. However, that would take a long time. I don't know if you know much about the Philippines, but it took something like 2-3 years for the United States to take over the Philippines. There was a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. I think I've got a picture of him. At least I thought I did. I thought I had a picture of Aguinaldo somewhere. Maybe I don't. But he was a Filipino rebel, and his forces tried to fight off the Americans who tried to take over, the Philippines, and eventually, I think it's like 100,000. I forget. They sent like a ton of troops over there. American forces and African American forces also fought in the Philippines as well, and they were led by John Pershing, who was called Blackjack Pershing. He was called Blackjack because he was famous for originally leading African American buffalo soldiers in battle, like San Juan Hill. Overall, that war to take over the Philippines was really expensive. They took control of it by 1902, and it cost like $800 million. And so they nicknamed that the American-Filipino War. Was later called the $1 Billion War, is what people called it. So that's basically what happened with Manila Bay. So yeah, we were able to take that, and then pretty much after that, we were able to conquer it afterwards, and get the number of troops it took over the years, but it took a lot to take control of the Philippines. Here's a map showing you the two different conflicts. Of course, they had one, of course, in the Pacific with the Philippines, which we seized right there. And then, of course, the other one, which would be Cuba as well. And one of the first things the United States did was we used our Navy to blockade Cuba with our forces, which we mostly bottled up Santiago. Santiago was kind of like their main capital in Cuba, not Havana at the time. And the Spanish fleet had been bottled up in there, like I said. They tried to sail out to try to get out and sail back to Spain. I think they had like 4 or 5 ships. On July 3rd, we fought another battle, which was a naval battle called the Battle of Santiago. And the U.S. Navy sunk that fleet too, as well, destroyed it. And so pretty much the whole Spanish Empire's fleet, the ones in like the Caribbean and in the Pacific, were all destroyed, by the U.S. And so that's going to enable us to take over Cuba. And we'll also get control of Puerto Rico as well. That's east of Dominican Republic. So that's basically what's going on with that. Then after that, of course, while we're blockading Cuba, the other thing that happened too was that the U.S. brought up forces into Cuba because we had to go in and try to defeat the Spanish there. And most of the ships disembarked from what is Tampa Bay in southern Florida. And one of the groups, of course, that went down there with them was the Rough Riders I told you about. It was supposed to be a cavalry unit, but they didn't actually have any horses. They were actually just fought as infantry. It's kind of funny about that. But they didn't have any horses. At least I think Teddy Roosevelt may have had a horse, something like that. But the other guys didn't have a horse. So that's basically the initial aspect of the war. And then what happened was the U.S. then started landing forces on the southern coast. They actually landed. Oh, and by the way, the forces of the Americans were led by this general named William Shafter. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was this old general, and he was really fat, and he couldn't ride a horse because he was so big. So they found a door that they ripped off a house or something like that. They carried him around on a door, which is kind of weird. And what's crazy about the war was they had ex-Confederates in the war that fought. They kind of came out of retirement to kind of volunteer. Fitzhugh Lee, who was later Robert E. Lee, I think it was one of his nephews, was in the war. They also have Fighting Joe Wheeler. You may have heard of Joe Wheeler. He was a famous cavalry commander of the Confederates in the war. And Wheeler was famous for sometimes lapsing in battle. They would be fighting the Spanish, and he would say something like, "We got the damn Yankees on the run." Oh, wait. Sorry. I mean the Spanish. Excuse me. You kept confusing the Spanish with being the Yankees with the North and all that. But they helped, eventually, win the war. And the main part of the war, which is the most important aspect of it, is, of course, Teddy Roosevelt, along with the Rough Riders and others, of course, would eventually take what is the heights of what is Santiago, which is really, really important. And we had already taken out their Navy at that point. So the big thing that the U.S. does in June of 1898 is they seized San Juan Heights. These are hills that are kind of around Santiago and its harbor. And there were 2 battles that were fought, which were very strategic. One was the Battle of El Caney, which was named after a hill called El Caney Hill. And the other was called San Juan Hill, that everybody always talks about and all of that. And what's really funny about San Juan Hill, it wasn't San Juan Hill. It was actually called Kettle Hill. But there was a hill that was nearby called San Juan Hill. And so that's what people called it. So I got kind of confused there. But they called it the Battle of San Juan Hill. Anyway, Lieutenant Colonel Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, also 2 units that were African-American, were involved in that battle. It was the bloodiest conflict, of the whole war. And anyway, Pershing led the African-American forces, and then Teddy Roosevelt led, of course, the Rough Riders. They stormed the hill, They took the heights. And there's a picture you see right there of Teddy Roosevelt with the American flag behind him with all the soldiers that had participated in it. And it led to like a siege of Santiago after that. And it forced the Spanish to eventually surrender. I think that's a wrong date. That should be June. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, July 17th is correct. Yeah, July 17th is correct. I think I got the wrong date here. That should be July 1st. Just see a typo there. But yeah, July 17th is actually when it is. And we only suffered 1,572 casualties. That's it. Of course, from that campaign, from the fight in those battles, 379 Americans died. That was it. In the battles for San Juan Heights and all of that. And it made Teddy Roosevelt, like I said, instant hero. The newspapers, talked about his Rough Riders and all that. They gave victory parades after the war. And they eventually propelled him to become the governor of New York. I want to say in 1898, he won that election. And then when McKinley ran for re-election in 1900, he decided to make Roosevelt his vice president because he was such a popular guy, and I'll get to it later, but what happens is McKinley gets assassinated in 1901, and that's how Roosevelt became president, kind of by accident, basically. But the guy went, like I said, within like 2-3 years or so, he went from being a nobody to being somebody, like that fast. It's amazing how that happened, Teddy Roosevelt. Right, there's another story I need to talk about too, with the Spanish-American War as well. I don't know if you have heard of Walter Reed. I'll kind of talk about him. There's a picture of Aguinaldo. Yeah, Walter Reed was one of like several of these doctors. He went to Cuba during the Spanish-American War. I believe he was a military doctor. And he did a bunch of experiments to figure out, what was causing diseases like malaria, typhoid fever, yellow fever. And I don't know if you know how he figured out how he did this. He basically took soldiers and he put them in different tents with like different mosquitoes that they found apparently. And what he figured out was there was a certain mosquito, I think he called it they call it the stigomyia mosquito. It was one of the main mosquitoes that was causing, I think it was malaria, I guess it was. And so they kind of started, they enabled them to figure out, the best way to do is to try to somehow eradicate mosquitoes and kill them off. And they also found later a cure for it somewhat, which is quinine, which, if you know about it, it's made from the bark of a tree. And of course, they think that is what I think is being used to try to cure coronavirus. The same thing. So quinine's been around a while, since I think the early 1900s. And the people don't want to use it or whatever, but it's possibly now a cure for coronavirus, they think. So anyway, just kind of talking about and of course, Walter Reed's got a hospital, like a military hospital named after him in Washington, D.C. that sometimes you'll see like some of the presidents go to when they got a physical or have some kind of emergency medical thing they need to do. So that's who Dr. Walter Reed was, and all of that. Now, of course, they had the war ended with the Treaty of Paris. Of course, in 1898, you can see there. You can see what the United States got out of the war. By the way, that was the total cost of the war itself, $250 million for a war that only lasted 113 days. That's amazing. Over 15,000 deaths. Most of the deaths were caused by disease, yellow fever, etc. 379 died in battle itself. So it's not that many died in battle overall. You can see that in the treaty, the United States gave us Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, etc. for $20 million. So that's basically what ends the war. We get all this territory from them for pretty much cheap overall. And however, the U.S. had this thing that they stipulated. We didn't end up annexing Cuba, which we did not. We actually gave them independence. So we allowed them to kind of develop their own government afterwards. But the U.S. still will, you know about it, intervene in Cuba for the next so many years. I know in Teddy Roosevelt, they intervened a couple times when they had problems. And we had the Plat Amendment, if you know about this, which was added to the kind of like the Treaty of Paris, which was ratified in the U.S. Senate. And the Plat Amendment basically said that the U.S. had a right to intervene in Cuba because it was so close to the United States. So Cuban affairs could affect the United States politically or whatever, economically, militarily. So they gave us a right to do that. We also took some of their land on the eastern part of Cuba, and we created a military base there, you know about, just called Guantanamo Bay, which is still there today. It's a naval marine base. And they, if you know, that's where they send all those terrorists to, like, and imprison them and all that. So United States really got a lot out of the war. The thing about the war was that the result of the war, you know, was that we became this imperial power afterwards, which we were. We were becoming more of a big naval power after the war. The U.S. has had more presence afterwards, you know, in the Caribbean, Latin America, Pacific Ocean. We took over Hawaii, also in 1898. We also annexed the Samoan Islands, which are now part of the United States as well. So that's basically all the things that, you know, the United States did, you know, throughout this war to make us like this big power that we are later. So Splendid War really made the U.S. What we are later power-wise. We already were economically on the way there, but militarily we weren't there yet, but we are afterwards. So U.S. is going to get more involved in other conflicts. World War I, as you know, World War II. We'll get more involved in, you know, issues throughout the world by and by. So that's pretty much lecture-wise on that today. Overall, you know, before I go, I will review a little bit. I can go ahead and do that real quick. So there's kind of like another slide there if you want to look at it later on the conclusions of the war. It wasn't just for the Philippines. I think we paid them also for Puerto Rico and Guam, which we seized, along with Wake Island as well. So let me review real quick, of course, over some of the things that we've done before a little bit. So going back to imperialism, of course, I talked about before how under McKinley, we started to become a more imperial power. And so I told you there was a difference between the new imperialism versus old imperialism. Old imperialism was the time going back to like Columbus, when, you know, the Spanish, the Portuguese, British, French started colonizing the world, conquering it. And then new imperialism was something that peaked around the 19th century, where imperial powers like Europe and the U.S., Japan, began to colonize parts of the world because they needed cheap labor, cheap natural resources because of the, you know, the Industrial Revolution and all that. The U.S. wanted places where they could put their navy and things like that. So we wanted to really get into and become an imperial power. I talked about Seward's folly, about how the U.S. acquired Alaska in 1867 and under Andrew Johnson. That was done by, remember, William Seward, his Secretary of State. We also annexed Hawaii in 1898. So that was like the beginnings of us kind of becoming an imperial power. Then I told you about some of these people here that kind of influenced imperialism. Told you about Hosea Strong, who was a reverend and writer who wrote a book called Our Country. They got the Americans to kind of think about trying to become an imperial power and spread Americanism everywhere, like the British were spreading white man's burden, like Africa and Asia. Frederick Jackson Turner had the Turner thesis. That was that thesis where he believed that if the U.S. didn't expand even outside our borders, that we would become a stagnant nation. that we had to become an imperial power if we wanted to continue as a major power. Other than that, we would fold. Alfred Mahan, of course, was a famous naval captain who wrote the book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. He said that all great powers had great navies. So he talked about how the U.S. needed to strengthen its navy, have like bases and islands where we could, supply our navy and stuff like that, have coaling stations and so on. And so that led to the so-called White Squadron or Great White Squadron that was built later, which is part of what sunk the Spanish fleet using, early type of dreadnought ships, battleships. Then today I talked about the conflict between Cuba and Spain. I told you that one of the big conflicts was because of revolutions breaking out in Cuba, which the Spanish losing control of it. And one of the big things was the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which raised tariffs on sugar being imported. And it was the cause of the Cuban Revolution of 1895. General Valeriano Weyler, who the press called, the Yellow Press called the Butcher, was forced to try to put it down. And so what happened. He put people in concentration camps in Cuba. And so the press took up with this. They decided that Spain was an enemy of us, that Cuba needed help. And so the Yellow Press got involved. What was the Yellow Press? It was the modern American newspapers at the time, like the New York Journal, New York World, that used sensationalism to, basically publish whatever they want news-wise. They use like headlines that were huge, like just, war with Cuba, war with Spain, that kind of thing. And William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer eventually got into a circulation war over it. And they think it was one of the causes of why the war was popular, because people hated Spain. It made them hate him. And so it got him involved in the war. McKinley, who was president at the time, of course, after 1896, was dogged by the press. Teddy Roosevelt made fun of him. He didn't really want to get involved because he wanted the U.S. to use diplomacy instead. However, the war broke out mostly because of two main things. The Dupuy de Lome letter in February of 1898, and then, of course, the destruction of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor was the other reason, of course, why the war broke out later. The U.S. did give the Spanish an ultimatum, I told you, but war hawks in Congress wanted to go to war. They saw it as a great opportunity, and so we declared war on Spain on April 11th, 1898. Then they had the Teller Revolution I told you. That was this anti-imperialist resolution passed by Henry Teller saying that we weren't going to annex Cuba and all that. But it didn't say anything about other territories, which is, of course, what happened, as you saw in the video. John Hay then described the war as a splendid little war. What did he mean by that? He meant that basically the war was this great war that was so easy with a lack of, men getting killed, and we got so much out of it. So it was a war that really propelled us, like I said, to being a major power. Congress also passed the Volunteer Army Act that led to the creation of volunteer armies like 1st Volunteer Cavalry, which the press called the Rough Riders. That unit was led by Teddy Roosevelt, who was the biggest hero of the war. The other big hero was George Dewey. Those are the two biggest heroes of the whole war. George Dewey, or Commodore Dewey, was famous for the Battle of Manila Bay. That was considered the first conflict of the whole war. That was where Dewey's naval force from China, that was based in Hong Kong, attacked Manila Bay in the Philippines. They destroyed the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay. That's going to be important, of course, in the U.S. taking control of the Philippines later. Then in Cuba, the U.S. forces, we, of course, took out the Spanish Navy, Battle of Santiago. They were wiped out. And then U.S. forces from Florida invaded Cuba. We landed on the southern coast of Cuba. In July, it was actually July of 1898, the U.S. eventually took control of Santiago, like the city. And there were two strategic battles that were very important. the battles of El Caney and the battles of San Juan Hill, which took place in July. July 1st is an important day to know they had. And Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, along with also African-American forces, eventually seized San Juan Heights, July 1st. It's actually the date, 1898. And that led to the fall of Santiago. When Santiago fell, it later forced the Cubans to surrender later. We also took Puerto Rico, and then I told you how Dr. Walter Reed did those malaria experiments in Cuba. That was kind of important in, getting people to realize what the cause of malaria is and other similar illnesses, which he figured out was caused by mosquitoes. Outcome of the war, we had the Treaty of Paris, 1898. The U.S. paid the Spanish $20 million for the Philippines, Puerto Rico. We also took over Guam, Wake Island. They also had the Plat Amendment. The Plat Amendment was this amendment that the Congress attached to the Treaty of Paris, which the Senate ratified. And the amendment said that the U.S. could intervene in Cuba because it was so close to the United States. It also said we could have bases in Cuba, which led to Guantanamo Bay as well. U.S., I told you, also annexed and took over Hawaii and the Samoan Islands. And so after that, the U.S. became a major power in the Pacific as an imperial power throughout the world. So that's pretty much a nutshell, about the Spanish-American War and what happened. I actually like the war. I think it's an interesting war, what happened. It's one of my favorite wars at that time in American history in the 19th century. And it does make us this, great power that we are, later on. So I'll talk more about what happens after the war. I'll get into like U.S. imperialism, like in China. I think I'll mention a little bit about that. And then next week I will be getting into talking about how Teddy Roosevelt comes in, because mostly I'm going to be talking about the Teddy Roosevelt administration in the early 1900s after William McKinley gets killed. So before we go, just want to remind you about a few things. Don't forget about your assignments that are due that's coming up really next week, not this week, but next week, which is the online first exam. Remember, that is going to be due around Tuesday. I think it's September the 29th. I might give you an extra day or whatever to work on it, but y'all need to really start working on that. Don't worry about these lectures right now I'm doing this week, the ones I'm posting on my YouTube channel later, but do work on the previous ones that are more important, that we've talked about, starting going back to Reconstruction. So you should be concentrating on Reconstruction up to, I think, the Gilded Age. And then I think on that last section, you've got up to like the labor movements and all that, labor movements and populism and all that. Don't worry about stuff this week right now, because you will have a quiz on that. I'm going to have a quiz on imperialism coming up, American imperialism, but it's going to be probably sometime, I want to say later next week, maybe Thursday. So before I go, don't forget, if anybody has any questions about this lecture that I posted, I'm going to post today on my YouTube channel. Let me know. You do get bonus points for comments, questions. So send me comments later, questions about that. And so that's about it for today. So hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. LSU, I think, is playing. Is Southern? I don't know if Southern's playing this weekend or not, football or not, but I know LSU's playing Mississippi State and all that. But so that's it for it. And so, let me know if you have any questions later about this lecture. So y'all take care. Have a good weekend.